So my name is Michael Taylor. I'm the director of the Hood Museum of Art at Dartmouth College, and it gives me immense pleasure to welcome you to the Hood tonight. We're so glad to be joined this evening by President Hanlon, Gail Gentes, the Hood Museum of Art Board of Overseers, and all of our guests, including many students and faculty that I'm seeing out in the rows, to tonight's lecture and opening reception for the Witness, Art and Civil Rights in the 60s exhibition. We are so thrilled to be hosting this landmark exhibition, which was curated by tonight's speaker, Kellie Jones, and Terry Carbone of the Brooklyn Museum to mark the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Civil Rights Act into law in July 1964. The 100 works of art on display resonate with the power and emotion of this crucial decade in American history. Since it opened on August 30th, the exhibition at the Hood has been an incredible success, both in terms of attendance as well as faculty and student engagement. I am delighted to report that 18 Dartmouth faculty members in 11 different departments are teaching with the exhibition this fall. Additionally, the Hood has hosted countless Dartmouth student events and discussions, and dozens of K-12 school groups from throughout New England have been incorporating the exhibition into their curriculum. We would like to thank the Brooklyn Museum for organizing such an engaging and thought-provoking exhibition, and for partnering with the Hood Museum of Art in its presentation. We are also thankful to Jack Tamagni, class of 1956, who is the chairman of the Brooklyn Museum's Board of Trustees and a former member of the Hood Board of Overseers. I'm sure that Jack joins me in thanking the Ford Foundation for their support of the exhibition and its national tour. We could not have presented the Witness exhibition at the Hood Museum of Art without the generous support of Hood Board members Dan Bernstein from the class of 1987 and his wife Claire Forster, and Yaz Kribiel, class of 1991, and his wife Kate. Their understanding and passion for the museum's teaching mission is deeply appreciated by everyone on campus. I also wish to thank our wonderful new provost, Carolyn Dever, and Associate Dean of the College, Elisabeth Agosto, for their support of the Hood and this exhibition in particular. It is now my great pleasure to introduce the 18th president of Dartmouth College, Philip Hanlon, class of 1977. Phil has been a great friend and champion of the Hood since his arrival on campus in June of 2013, and we are honored by his presence here tonight. Phil.
Thank you, Michael, and thanks everyone for being here. It is a great privilege indeed to be joining you this evening for this celebration. I want to express my deep gratitude in particular to everyone who played a role in bringing this important exhibition to Dartmouth, but especially Kellie Jones, Juliet Bianco, and Jessica Womack. So let's thank them. Gail and I had a unique treat when, just as it was opening, Juliet and Jessica gave us our own private tour of the stunning. It's a stunning exhibition. So, having works of this scope and scale at the Hood give our whole community, both on campus and beyond, the chance to connect with the art and artists they might not otherwise have the chance to see. We are truly fortunate to have such a momentous opportunity, and I hope everyone will encourage their friends and colleagues to take full advantage of this. As you know, Witness marks 50 years since the Civil Rights Act of 1964. I was a young kid then, and I venture that many here, well, maybe not so many, but many were not born yet, was what I was going to say. But certainly on our campus, many were not born yet. But still, the questions that are raised, questions of justice and equality and power, they still echo today. They're still very vibrantly through our own halls and in communities across the nation. In those days in 1964, as the country grew and evolved, so did Dartmouth. We helped found A Better Chance, a program that increased the number of young people of color on campuses across the nation. Dartmouth's first Afro-American Center was created. The Native American Studies program, the first of its kind in the US, was founded. And we have visits from Martin Luther King, from Stokely Carmichael, and from Malcolm X, who appeared just next door at Spalding Auditorium. People often ask me, well, this is probably the most frequent question I get is, what has changed at Dartmouth since I left as a student in 1977? And without a doubt, it's the diversity of the campus, and in particular, the diversity of the student body. The transition to a more diverse campus has and will continue to be a pillar of strength for our community. But there's much progress still to be made, and I hope that this exhibition, Witness, provides you with a jumping off point for dialogue around these fundamental questions around race and diversity, inclusion, social justice, and the work that you see here will inspire you to think about what role you can play in creating a more supportive, welcoming, and inclusive environment, both here at Dartmouth, but in the world at large. So enjoy the lecture by Kellie, and thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, President Hanlon, for those wonderful remarks. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce two key members of the Hood staff, Juliet Bianco, class of 1994, and Jessica Womack, class of 2014, who have worked tirelessly to make the Witness exhibition one of the most successful in the museum's history in terms of campus outreach and engagement. Juliet Bianco is our inspirational deputy director at the Hood Museum of Art and the in-house curator of the Witness exhibition. Jessica Womack worked alongside Juliet as a senior intern throughout the 2013 to 14 academic year, and since July has served as a curatorial assistant at the museum. Please join me in welcoming Juliet and Jessica to the podium.
Thank you, Michael. Welcome. When we gaze into the soulful eyes of the subject of Benny Andrews' painting, Witness, on the screen, we can't help but be drawn into her world, imagine her story, and contemplate her legacy. As the work's title implies, this unknown woman presents herself as evidence of what she has seen and experienced in her lifetime. It is the part of the fabric of her being, and so the artist embeds that fabric into the surface of the painting. But if we read the title in the imperative case, it can be taken as a command, witness. And by bearing witness, we must think, we must act, we must respond. And that, for me, is the power of this exhibition. With it, we honor the thoughts, the actions, and responses of the 66 extraordinary artists brought together in potent dialogue by Kellie Jones and Teresa Carbone. Thank you. Over the course of the past 18 months, every member of the Hood Museum's team contributed to the presentation of Witness in substantial ways. I'd like to call out just a few: Patrick Dunphy, Nicole Williams, John Reynolds, Matt Zayatz, Kathleen O'Malley, Sharon Reed, Rebecca Karp, and Leslie Wellman. The thoughtfulness that you bring to your work is evidenced everywhere in the galleries. Thank you, Michael, for making sure that this exhibition came to Dartmouth and for supporting the work of the team. Jessica Womack, curatorial assistant at the museum, deserves special recognition and thanks. It is impossible to think of this exhibition without also thinking of her. She has been an incredible partner and has enabled the most thought-provoking student engagement that we've seen here at the museum. On behalf of everyone at the museum, I want to thank the many students, staff, and faculty at Dartmouth and members of our alumni and community for the vital role that they played in helping shape the Hood Museum's presentation of Witness. Whether you offered critical advice as a participant in a student focus group last winter, wrote a Community Voices label about a work of art, narrated a stop on the Hood's first student written and produced audio tour, or wrote for the Alumni Voices section of the quarterly magazine, your words ring throughout this exhibition. I want to invite everyone up to the exhibition galleries on the second floor directly following tonight's lecture, where students and recent alumni who studied freedom songs with past Montgomery Fellow Dr. Bernice Regan will perform a selection of songs to commemorate the occasion. Refreshments and live music then follow in Kim Gallery. Please also join us tomorrow afternoon at 2 p.m. in the exhibition galleries, where exhibition co-curator Teresa Carbone, the Andrew W. Mellon Curator of American Art at the Brooklyn Museum, will lead a special tour of the exhibition and how it came together. Thank you.
Good evening. So I get the amazing pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Dr. Kellie Jones. Dr. Kellie Jones is Associate Professor in Art History and Archaeology at the Institute for Research in African American Studies at Columbia University. She received her Bachelor's of Arts from Amherst College and received her PhD in the History of Art from Yale University in 1999. Throughout the course of her long and distinguished career, Dr. Jones has explored her research interest, including African American and African diasporic artists, Latino and Latin American artists, and museum theory in countless articles, books, and museum exhibitions. Dr. Jones is a highly regarded scholar in the field of art history. She was selected for the High Museum of Art's inaugural David C. Driscoll Prize in African American Art and Art History in 2005. Additionally, she was chosen for the Terra Foundation for American Art in Europe's Scholar in Residence program in 2013, where she worked in Giverny, France. She also received a Warhol Foundation of Arts Writers Grant in 2013 to work on her upcoming book, Art is an Excuse, Conceptual Strategies, 1968 to 1983. Dr. Jones has been making waves in the art community throughout her career due to her commitment to exploring the work and role of Black artists throughout the 20th century, specifically during 1960s, 70s, and 1980s. In 2011, an exhibition curated by Dr. Jones entitled Now Dig This, Art in Black Los Angeles, 1960 to 1980, opened at the UCLA Hamer Museum. This major exhibition was the first of its kind to showcase the work of a number of artists, African American artists and their contemporaries who were living in Los Angeles and responding to the events and issues like the Civil Rights Movement and Black Power movement taking place in the city during that time. Dr. Jones published her book, I Minded, Living and Writing Contemporary Art, in which she examines how her parents, poets Hetty Jones and Amiri Baraka, and the artists, musicians, and writers in their professional and social circles shaped her academic path and her focus on bringing attention to artists, Black, Latino, and female, often ignored by the Academy. Witness Art and Civil Rights in the 60s, which Dr. Jones co-curated with Teresa Carbone, powerfully demonstrates how 66 artists of various racial and ethnic backgrounds use their art as a form of activism to make political statements about the need for racial equity and justice in the United States during the 1960s. We are so fortunate to have Dr. Jones here with us today to share her curatorial vision and her scholarly perspective on this tumultuous time in U.S. American history. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Kellie Jones for her lecture entitled Civil Rights Act, Art and Activism in the 1960s.
Hi, everybody. Wow, full house. Thank you so much for inviting me here. It's great to have Witness come to the Hood Museum of Art. I want to thank, of course, my co-curator, who I couldn't have done this without her, Terry Carbone, and also here tonight is Connie Choi, a research assistant on the show. So they're here from Brooklyn. And just to thank you all, of course, thank you to Jessica for a great introduction, and to the Board of Overseers here, and of course, Michael Taylor, Juliet Bianco, and everybody. I have been wanting to come here for so long to see the Orozco murals. Finally, I got here. And they are just so amazing. You all are so lucky to have them in your midst, and I am so thankful that you take such beautiful care of them, and it's just evident. They are just wonderful. And in thinking about, the president talking about who was here in the 60s and how many civil rights leaders visited, And I was thinking earlier about when Orozco came here in the 1930s, what was it like? What did he see? What did he experience? But obviously, this is a place that has welcomed all sorts of forward-thinking ideas from that time and probably earlier, so I really want to thank you all, this community, for your forward-thinkingness. So I am going to go on and, now the screen looks different, and put my slides up, my own slides. You'll have to see this version without me hiding it. All right, let's see. Great. So in the tradition that I was trained in as a graduate student, you dedicate your lecture to people. And this year, I am dedicating all my lectures to my father, Amiri Baraka, who passed away earlier this year, in January. So I just dedicate it to him, not just because he's my dad, which was great, but also because he allowed me and so many, many people all over the world to talk about things that hadn't been talked about creatively. So I really thank him for that path. Thank you. He allowed us to take. And in the spirit of him, I want to read one of his very brief poems. It's called In the Funk World. If Elvis Presley is king, who is James Brown? God. Okay. Yes, he was a funny guy. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 reaffirms the entitlement to constitutional rights for all U.S. citizens and relief from discrimination. In the most basic sense, it speaks to the bonds that hold civil society together and the ways that a nation can best secure the well-being of its citizens. The Act seeks to assure access to the benefits of nationhood, particularly for African Americans who, as the scholar Alondra Nelson has written, over the centuries suffered from an unrelieved sense of withered or emaciated citizenship. In other words, a relationship to the nation that was not full and proper. In her book on the Black Panther Party, Nelson focuses on how health advocacy specifically became an approach to political and civil equality, a way to press for the proper function of the state regarding its population. Health was a site where the stakes of injustice could be exposed and a prism through which struggles for equality could be refracted. Health could also connote inalienable human attributes and freedoms. For the Panthers, the notion of health became a mutable sign that could signify many ideals, encompassing the individual and the larger polis. The healthy body became a symbol of social justice. It is this idea of a total well-being that I want to retrieve here as the intersection, too, between art and civil rights. Art was also a way to access or extend the sense of well-being, as numerous artists during this period understood. Practitioners from Noah Purifoy in Los Angeles to Ligia Clark in Brazil shared participatory practices that were meant to engage and enhance the social and mental ease of their audiences. Purifoy, in particular, endeavored to address African American youth in Watts, an area where an entire population had been dismissed, subjected to a failing economy and deindustrialization. In this way, creativity and beauty encouraged and helped engender a feeling of individual satisfaction, self-love, and in this sense, health. Just as lay medical activism practiced by the Panthers and other progressive groups can be seen as the further democratization of medicine during this period, that claim can also be made for art's life with the rise of alternative spaces, homegrown galleries, and community exhibitions that brought art to the people and gave them agency, entitlement to their own aesthetics and beauty. Health and art were among the myriad ways that politics and collective action were accessed during this period of societal change in the mid to late 20th century. Some of the works in Witness, Art and Civil Rights in the 60s directly consider what makes up the bonds of civil society. They address ideas of citizenship through actions or visual presentations that can be thought of as civil and framed, for instance, as a dialogue with art world trends of their time. Several of these conversations took the form of experiments in international abstraction. We need to consider how global art framings could and did embrace issues of social change, particularly in certain ways that the non-objective touched down in the United States. Paintings by Leon Polk Smith and Virginia Jaramillo both take on the color black as a way to access and yet to some degree elide questions of equality. Their engagement with an all-over field of almost complete blackness plays with the idea of the monochrome painting, which can be taken as a sign of the deferral of meaning, rendering problematic the notions of fixed signification. As the art historian Angeline Morrison argues, after the work of Kazimierz Malevich, the monochrome was seen as the ultimate signifier of creativity. It was the essence of painting, and yet its very ubiquity, found casually on streets, in homes, and workplaces, signaled the collectivity of daily life. Charles Alston's Black and White No. 7, a classic American gestural abstraction, is classic American gestural abstraction, and living in New York placed him at the center of such experimentation. He was also part of Spiral, a group of artists in New York, including Merton Simpson, Norman Lewis, and Romare Bearden, who are also in the exhibition, that came together to think collectively about how their practice could engage with civil rights activity of the time. For the group's single documented show in its Greenwich Village space in 1964, it committed to one loose organizing principle, restricting submitted works to the colors of black and white. Spiral's nod to integration, perhaps inspired by the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom of 1963, had already been embodied in Alston's Black and White No. 7 of 1961. The painting serves as a sublime riposte to this physical and often bloody struggle for social change. Mel Edwards' Chano also partakes of an abstract visual language that signaled a non-hierarchical meeting ground, a platform of civil discourse. It enlarges American gestural abstraction to 3 dimensions and is in part a sculptural conversation with the likes of John Chamberlain's Crushed Steel, but here weight, suspension, and chain can also allude to black containment and disenfranchisement. As a result of segregation, style and imagery take on the cast of self-empowerment in African American communities. Beauty is its own battlefield. In light of this history, the photographer and historian Deborah Willis thinks about how beauty has been posed. In this sense, creating an iconic desired body that acknowledges the self is a visual assertion of political power made to one's neighbors and to the larger world. A racial rearticulation of power and access in the 1960s, the emblematic uncompromising self, also arrives in imagery. In her analysis of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee's, or SNCC's, relationship to the media and photography, the scholar Lee Rayford noted a move over time away from a strict sense of reportage and toward articulating a more consciously constructed aesthetic vision, and one that was in dialogue with the increasingly dominant Black Power movement. Charles White's Awaken from the Unknowing may strike viewers today as overly romantic in its imaging of a woman lovingly poring over a desk full of newspapers. But in 1961, the year it was drawn, there was rarely such lush attention to the lyrical figure as a Black female, while the right to read, to be educated, to know, once disallowed in enslavement, continued to be impeded in the 20th century under Jim Crow laws. These statutes had been struck down with the case of Brown versus Board of Education of 1954, but in terms of custom, were in no way fully abolished by 61. In its time, Awaken was immensely popular, with folks from around the country writing to obtain a version of the drawing in print. SNCC put the image on the cover of a brochure announcing its freedom schools and reprinted it again, illustrating a book review in a May 1967 newsletter. SNCC not only counted on the image itself to herald its educative project, but White's reputation as an artist who aligned himself with progressive causes from the 1930s onward was no doubt part of the package. Having lived these debates of art, aesthetic, and Black practice throughout the century, the 1960s are significant for Romare Bearden, in that they represent his breakthrough to a wider public. Bearden's exquisite collages, which propelled him to art world stardom in this period, used the pasted paper medium to revise Black representation through a melange of painted and drawn pieces, along with photographic bits culled from magazines. It is apropos that perhaps the most important single year of Bearden's breakout success, the year that people sat up and took notice of one more Black artist, was the same one that the Civil Rights Act became law. Just as rights organizations like SNCC and the Black Panthers ably mobilized the medium of photography for their causes, Bearden remixed similar imagery. The result was the backstory to the visual message of a hip young Blackness that the Panthers and SNCC embodied. It was the broader context, the everyday, as well as the roots of African American culture in the South, a longer history of the Black freedom struggle. Bearden's sermons, The Walls of Jericho, provides an additional opening onto beauty that became visible in this moment, the recurring and diverse visualization of African art. On the one hand, this development signaled the return of a repressed Black heritage, the font of glorious traditions in a time before slavery and segregation, demonstrating what Africa had contributed to the world. On the other hand, the reassertion of African imagery was a perhaps not so sly reminder of the blossoming of 20th century modernism, since the arts of Africa contributed to the formation of modern codes of vision, states of address, and aesthetic choices. Many Bearden collages of the 60s overflow with fragments of sculptures and masks, making the case for these dual interpretations of Africa and diasporic form in the Western context. The artist's title refers to the biblical Battle of Jericho, which the Israelites won in part through the reverberating power of music. In many sermons in the African American tradition, the marginalized and diasporic Israelites stand in for the experience of Black peoples. Similarly, in this work, Black music and art explode the walls of exclusion. Barbara Chase Rabu is inspired by the complexity of African masquerade performance. Chase Rabu's Monument to Malcolm X #2 translates the typical wearable wooden superstructure or mask, over fiber or fabric costume into a commanding stationary presence whose impressive profile also embodies the glory of a great leader. For Frank Bowling, Africa and its diasporic inheritance in the Americas are rendered as symbols in Night Journey. The maps and electric colors of the painting give it a pop edge while at the same time not letting go of the painterly gestures that many others renounced during this period. The work's title makes sense of this painterliness as an evocation, as the scholar Kabina Mercer has said, of the flows and wateriness of the Afro-Atlantic Middle Passage. Emma Amos and Barclay Hendricks were younger artists who took up the issue of the beautiful for the late 20th century, both in distinct ways, in dialogue with pop art codes. Hendricks is not only in conversation with pop, but with photorealism and even hard-edge abstraction, in painting that strikes a cool pose and revels in its notoriety. He does not, however, wholly embrace the edgy coldness of Andy Warhol, for instance, as Brandon Joseph has described the latter's no-comment paintings. imagery in some ways barely transformed from documentary to artistic modes. For another view of Hendricks and Amos's approach to pop coolness, we might instead turn to Robert Farris Thompson, who has identified a certain fearlessness in a wide-ranging and diasporic aesthetic of the cool. Huey Copeland has discussed the subjects in Hendricks' works as enmeshed in a web of consumer spectacle and kitsch, and yet, to a certain degree, struggling against such forces to create their own place. These figures attract the gaze, yet also defend against primitivist projection, carving out a space where the self and its aesthetic construction can take center stage. In Icon for My Man, Superman never saved any black people, Bobby Seale, a man poses in requisite panther shades, sporting a t-shirt with a superhero logo and melding pop strategies with black power imagery and messaging. Emma Amos was born in Atlanta and studied art at London Central School of Art, later Central St. Martin's College of Art and Design. Experimenting with abstraction while in Europe, Amos recommitted herself to figuration when she returned stateside, retaining the amorphous and ambiguous backgrounds in early pieces, such as Three Figures. Her exuberant color fields provided exciting backdrops for selected poised bodies, their black and white skins a collection of surfaces whose browns and creams are also subtly multiple rather than solid tones. Amos's lexicon of bodies works well in the context of pop. In her landscape of multi-hued subjects, integration, too, a basis of civil society in the United States, is visualized. James Rosenquist relies on similar methods in painting for the American Negro, but his title is more pointed. Others are even more explicit. Edward Kienholz, in It Takes Two to Integrate Cha-Cha-Cha, uses assemblage to conjure paired black and white freedom riders, both scarred by tire tracks. Sponsored by the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, the Freedom Riders of 1961 tested the desegregation of public transportation in southern states. Kienholz would of course return to issues of social inequality and race throughout his career, mostly in more caustic combinations, as with his 1972 five-car stud. Norman Rockwell was another white artist who tackled questions of integration in his work from the period, and people are always shocked when they see Norman Rockwell in the show. I think it's the most shocking artist who's in the show for most people. They're like, Norman Rockwell, what, are you kidding me? But hey, Norman Rockwell, he's American. You know, he was affected like everybody else was. We see this as early as 1961 with his The Golden Rule, Paean to Global Harmony. Constrained by the Saturday Evening Post directive that people of color not appear to mingle as equals, but only as emblems of servitude within the picture plane, Rockwell nevertheless includes a black man in a shirt and tie, alluding to white-collar professions on the upper right, and a black schoolgirl on the lower left, whose pinafore and books shows her to be modeled after one of the youngest icons of civil rights, Ruby Bridges. Among Rockwell's most well-known images, The Problem We All Live With, 1963, was his first published work after he left the Post for Look magazine. The painting commemorates the 6-year-old Bridges' integration of the all-white William Frantz School in New Orleans in 1960. Here the girl is the painting's focus, her innocence and purity redoubled in her white dress and shoes that replaced the school uniform feel of her pinafore. Accompanied by a contingent of U.S. deputy marshals, the diminutive Bridges is determined, striding resolutely forward, walking bravely into history like hundreds of other children across the nation. So, you know, it's interesting to see how he really, even though he does this work that celebrates her in 1963 and puts her in this dress, obviously she's already present in his mind early on, because you can see this really does take on the flavor of how this picture appears. And of course, her picture is all over the newspaper at the time. 6 years old. So young people out there, you know, my hat's off to young people. People have commented about the visual juxtapositions in Witness, Art and Civil Rights in the 60s, how artists are placed in dialogue that have never been seen together before, although they were making art at the same time and grappling with the issues of that era. The range of stylistic approaches includes Black arts movement work, abstract and figurative expressionism, pop, assemblage, and conceptual art, along with photography. At the Brooklyn Museum, I loved our grouping of Betty Saar, Whitey's Way, from 1970, a small assemblage holding its own in a room full of large paintings by Norman Lewis, Double Cross, this is going from left to right, Double Cross, 1971, and of course you'll see them all upstairs. Sam Gilliam, Red April, 1970, and Philip Guston, City Limits, 1969. And just having that Betty Saar there, just holding her own with those big paintings by those big guys, was great, you know, and I'd never even really thought about it either until we put them in the room together. So it's great to have these dialogues that are created with the work, and that then creates dialogue in the world. A number of works in Witness trace the struggle itself, the actual fight, the battle for the true rights of citizenship. In USA 65, the painter Merton Simpson captures these battles in the confrontation of shapes and broad black lines, collaged words and forms that use dripping paint not to build up an all-over abstract field, but to wield these accidental marks as the ooze of blood or sweat, masked like heads with bared teeth, snarling, embody conflict as well. Fashioned in Mexico, where she lived for much of her career, Elisabeth Catlett's mahogany sculpture, Homage to My Young Black Sisters, sends the message of Victory International, the fist held high, in concert with those creating change around the world. Jack Whitten has come to be known for his abstract canvases, experimenting with materials, color, optics, and serial form. However, he started his practice with a swirling figurative palette, dreamlike and surrealistic. It was in some ways a highly charged approach to painting, a device to grapple with racism, not as an intellectual choice, as he recalled, but one more visceral, what the artist has called a, quote, psychological necessity. You work with it, or it works with you, end quote. One of his series from the late 60s takes as its starting point various moments in the life of the civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. The canvases, fantastical environments, imagine the space of the dreamer, from King's epic I Have a Dream speech delivered at the March on Washington, and seen here in Whitten's King's Wish, Martin Luther's Dream of '68. It is also the garden, paradise, where all people meet, not in conflict, but in love, and finally envisions King as an oracle insisting on our freedom. Jack Whitten's home is Bessemer, Alabama, about 6 miles outside the industrial seat of Birmingham. His stark stories of segregation remind us that the civil rights movement was a continuation of the centuries-long struggle for Black freedom. He came to New York in 1960, only a few years before the southern city would be seared in our minds with violent images. In the spring of 1963, local activists in Birmingham, along with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, launched a series of protests and demonstrations called Project C4 Confrontation. It sent media images around the world of youthful protesters brutally attacked by agents of the white segregationist power structure, using dogs and high-pressure water hoses, inflicting beatings, and resorting to mass arrests and incarcerations. The city's reputation earned it the nickname Bommingham, with a history of unsolved bombings meant to intimidate the Black population, dating back to the 40s. The most infamous bombing occurred on the morning of September 15, 1963, at the 16th Street Baptist Church, as parishioners prepared for Youth Day services, 4 girls, Carol Robertson, Cynthia Wesley, Denise McNair, and Addie Mae Collins, perished at the church. And later that day, in separate incidents, 2 boys, Johnny Robinson and Virgil Ware, were killed as part of the same outbreak of violence in a city that was anti-labor, pro-Klan, and anti-integration, where white supremacy ruled. It was not only the individual perpetrators of the crime that the nation should be concerned with, warned Dr. King, but, quote, the system, the way of life, the philosophy which produced the murderers, end quote. In alluding to a system and way of life, Dr. King conjures a more expansive time frame for an understanding of rights movements as well as colonial conflicts. Of course, violent adventures have always been linked to imperial projects, and as the sociologist Paul Gilroy argues, took on the shape of racial mass destruction that was closer to the work of extermination than control and settlement. Colonial geographies were testing grounds for modern weaponry and disciplinary structures, as well as aesthetic appropriations that could be carried out with a disregard for human life that was racially marked. The notion of the long and broad history of civil rights struggles connects the present with the past, the local with the global. Performance scholar Rebecca Snyder has theorized this as a temporal tangle or temporal leak in which the past disrupts the present and the bygone is not entirely gone by, but haunts everyday life. In other words, the struggles of the 1960s are the struggles of the 1860s, all-encompassing violence, dogs snapping at human heels, the temporal inertia that enjoins the colonized to stay in your place, the actions that unceasingly break these codes. The targeting of youth in modern civil rights clashes, as in Birmingham, should come as no surprise. The average age of SNCC members was 21. It was the integration of schools, among other places, that brought recriminations not just at colleges and high schools, but, as previously noted in the case of Ruby Bridges, even at the elementary level. The boys and girls killed that September day in Birmingham in 1963 ranged in age from 11 to 16. They are commemorated in Charles White's Birmingham Totem, in which a youthful figure stands atop a mound of debris. A plumb line dangles from his finger. He is the architect of the new community and world. Like White, Ben Shahn was known for his social realist and politically engaged practice dating back to the 30s. Human Relations portfolio, Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner, honors James Cheney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, 3 young volunteers killed in Mississippi during Freedom Summer, the voter registration and education project of 1964. The mixed media archaeological find number 21, The Aftermath, by Rafael Montañez Ortiz, allegorizes the battered, buried, drowned body, its tortured form outlining the shape of hatred. Lee Rayford has looked at the notion of the moment, of the now in the civil rights movement. Now was an utterance, an act that made the future, freedom, equity, utopia emerge. It was real time, the new world to be brought into being by unrelenting action and activism. Now put an end to the second-class citizenship of the past. In this vein, Freedom Now became a prized slogan popularized by SNCC. New configurations of the American polity are imagined in several works that employ this phrase. Mark de Souvreau's Freedom Now is a construction in steel. Daniel LaRue Johnson's Freedom Now #1 embeds a fragment of material culture from the trenches. A button emblazoned with the words emerges from a pitch-covered mixed media canvas. Faith Ringgold acknowledges the youthful freedom makers in Study Now from her American People series. In a portrait of a beautiful and thoughtful Black woman with a book, she not only acknowledges the students who were the driving force of the movement in the 60s, but also, as substituting study for freedom, actually connects the two words, reminding us about the struggles for parity in education, as well as the kind of liberation that knowledge brings. Freedom now was vivid in the media images of these political and social actors. Photography and witness brings us to the beloved community of civil rights and visualizes how their will towards collective utopia was challenged, as seen in captivating pictures by Danny Lyon, Charles Moore, Bruce Davidson, and Moneta Sleet. Robert Sangstack's and Ernest Withers' images outline the broader frames of civil rights activism and life. What Rayford calls insurgent visibility, the making visible of one's political and social power and subjectivity on one's own terms, is manifest in Gordon Parks' pictures of the Black Panthers and Black Muslims, including the great boxing champion Muhammad Ali. Photography fulfilled many roles in its visualization of the civil rights movement. It illuminated the brutality against African Americans that had gone unseen in the wider world. At the same time, such visibility could act as a shield against further violence. The photograph shared with other art forms in this exhibit its notion of the remade Black subject and sought to dismantle and unmake dominant views of subservience and worthlessness. And of course, most people, when we put the show together, didn't realize that there was actually other kinds of objects besides photographs and televisual images, right? That there were paintings and sculpture about civil rights as well. So those were the things that really brought those ideas into people's lives, photographs. The struggle for rights was also mirrored in burgeoning contemporary artistic practice. The role of what was new, what was now, mixed electronic and conceptual media, and the expansiveness and conjoining of forms as the only way to tell stories of mid and late 20th century experience. One such object is J. Gerald's urban wall suit. Gerald combines the contemporaneous mural movement, particularly the famed Wall of Respect of 1967 of her Chicago home, graffiti, and a sense of urban landscape with painting. The traditional canvas is understood here through its constituent parts, pigment on cloth, and its confluence with other uses as quilt, as clothing. Gerald was in the forefront of uses of fabric and soft sculpture championed by the likes of Faith Ringgold in the feminist art movement, and she anticipated the confluence of fashion and fine art that is so prevalent today. Of course, these pieces were not content on the wall, but traveled around the city, worn by the artist herself, and you see her there with her wearing her urban wall suit. And I know she was here a few weeks ago. I hope you guys got to meet them. They're the coolest. The performative nature of Gerald's urban wall suit is paralleled in works of performance by Benjamin Patterson, a classically trained bassist who connected with early manifestations of the Fluxus movement while serving in the US military in Germany. His first symphony engages both military exercises and civil rights protests through sonic cues produced, of course, by unlikely materials, while its participatory form enlists the power of the franchise in requesting audience members to vote. Yoko Ono works in a similar score-based, Fluxus-inspired form in Voice Piece for Soprano, in which the simple instructions to scream against various vague and abstract aspects of life, wind, wall, sky, nevertheless channel the era's ethos of protest. In Witness, we also find the validation of the poster as the quintessential activist art form. Vibrant and with endless possibilities of image, the poster was inexpensive to make, own, and distribute. It was flexible. It appeared in rallies as vibrant speech and protest, in homes and workplaces as a signal of personal politics and aesthetic choices. Robert Indiana's paintings take the bold graphics and hues of the poster. In the Confederacy, Alabama of 1965, a central map locates Selma, the starting point that year of a march to the state capital of Montgomery and across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, a march that was met with such violent repression it has been remembered as Bloody Sunday. Though part of a series addressing struggles of the day, like Alabama, each painting takes its title and compositional structure from a different state that had seceded from the Union during the Civil War. Rupert Garcia was known for his poster works made as part of the contemporaneous Chicano movement. His location in the Bay Area, with its sense of multicultural or local third world struggle, is reflected in his Black Man and Flag. Barbara Jones-Hogu has discussed the powerful significance of poster art for the Chicago-based artist group Afrocobra, as well as her own practice. Of prime importance were the poster's democratic accessibility, its marshaling of color and inspiring imagery, the ease of printmaking and incorporation of design, and the impact of lettering that was active, that spoke to thinking minds. Her screen print, Unite, has become iconic of the group's aesthetic and political profile. Her notable portrayal of women also gives us a fuller grasp of the human textures of these rights movements generally. Changes in politics and representation, in notions of access to rights and citizenship, possibilities of belonging, and more expansive and profound imaging of the Black self in America are invested in all the objects in witness, art, and civil rights in the 60s. They are the work of bodies in motion, rendering themselves visible on their own terms. They emerge from and illuminate the assembling, protesting, demonstrating, insisting, and persisting acts of the era. They are works that at once make visible and honor how human beings vanquished calcified boundaries, going from purportedly accepting to actively rejecting their place at the bottom of the polis. This is certainly understood in works by Jacob Lawrence, Soldiers and Students, in which the courage of young people is on view, in water-based paintings on paper and board that embody, too, the mobility and democracy of radical graphics. Jeff Donaldson's Wives of Shango visualizes the insurgent figure of the Black Power period, a more uncompromising profile of rights and visuality. Homage to Nina Simone by Bob Thompson is not necessarily a portrait painting. Instead, glorious and brilliantly colored bodies activate an equally electric landscape, celebrating a performer who used her public presence to keep the cause of Black freedom ever present in our collective imaginations, most famously in her song, Mississippi Goddam of 1964. These artists and peoples press onward, unstopped and unstoppable. The futurity and inevitability of freedom instantiated by bodies in motion. Their goal, total well-being and humanity in a global context, which we connect to concepts of aesthetic pleasure and possibility. Thank you. Questions or lights? I don't have to be in the dark. Ideas? Okay. Yeah.
So obviously, you're a scholar in this field. What were the biggest surprises that you came across in organizing the exhibition? Were there any artists that you just never heard about and discovered by this?
Not people that ended up in the show per se. There was an artist we wanted to include, but the work wasn't available. Actually, a Haitian artist named Hervé Telemaque, who was active in France with the Nouveau Realistes, and who knew there was a Haitian artist active in France with the Nouveau Realistes in early 60s. And so we wanted to include one of his works, but they're few around and not a lot of scholarship on his work, so hopefully more of his work will come out soon. But I can't think of anybody. I'm walking through the show in my head like, was there anybody I hadn't heard of? No, I heard of the artist. I maybe, for instance, with the Norman Rockwell piece we were able to get, which was, what is the name? Now I'm losing it. New Kids in the Neighborhood. Thank you. It's 6 o'clock. New Kids in the Neighborhood, Negroes in the Suburbs. we wanted to get The Problem We All Live With, but that is a very popular piece by Rockwell, and of course he had a show that was traveling, so he couldn't get that. So I hadn't known about that piece. And I think we agreed, Terry and I, that that was actually a better piece even, because it showed how, people in dialogue really, in some way, are beginning a dialogue about things. And again, still focusing on the youthful protagonist, which was very exciting. I think if I was surprised by anything, it was to do just more and more research about young people. And that's why it's really exciting for the show to come to a teaching institution, a museum that's on a college campus that celebrates, that is about young people, but also celebrates them and celebrates the power of what young people have accomplished. And so to look at so many of those works and see how artists themselves were focusing on the activities of young people too was really great to see. Yes?
So there's a ton of work that could have been in this show, and I'm curious, when you were, kind of cutting down to the final pieces, why would something not end up in the final
We don't have enough space. I mean, but that would be it. There's, I always say this is about any show. Not everybody can be in every show, right? So you have to make decisions. That's what being a curator is. And so some things will go on to the next iteration, and some pieces will be picked up by somebody else in another mode. I mean, shows are always, what's amazing about exhibitions is that you have to remember they're ephemeral, right? And so they disappear, and then somebody else takes it up and moves it to the next phase. But it's usually, we couldn't fit it in. It was great that we decided only to have works that were really made during this period, because of course people have thought about that since that time. You can have something from right now, you can have works by somebody like Hank Willis Thomas, for instance, that think about that time period, or Leslie Hewitt, these other artists working today. But that was one way to cut it down, was to really focus on works that were made in that time as these things were going on. And really trying to start with the year 1964 of the Civil Rights Act itself, and really kind of circle around out from that year in terms of works being made on that year and then moving out from there.
Since you brought up the Orozco, I was thinking as you were going through the images, something that hadn't occurred to me when I was looking at the show, which was Orozco has the image across from the reserve desk of the worker reading, and it's often treated as an African-American figure. And I was noting throughout these images how much more common it is for artists to focus on female protagonists in the educational context. And just sort of wondering about that, thinking about the many ways in which that is one can think about that gendering in terms of the relationship between Orozco, in the 1930s, the depiction of an African-American worker is making explicit kind of really potentially dangerous politics, linking with the union, potentially conjuring other kinds of labor violence and working class rights. And in these images, particularly because of the power of the Driggs image and the concentrating that issue around the vulnerability of a very small little girl, the artist's tactics to sort of dramatize that cause through female protagonists.
I don't know. I mean, I think it's great to think about that. You can see the rise of this image of women as powerful figures, no matter how small. And that I can actually show you. But I don't think they're only women. This is one of the works that didn't make it into the show, of course. There's so many wonderful works. But, for instance, this work on the left, hopefully you all can see it. It's a little bit washed out. Maybe we can turn down the lights just a little bit to see that work. Anyway, you can get the general idea. It's another student. It's a guy, right? And I really would have loved to have, we actually started out thinking about another organization for the show where we would have focused on certain artists, one maybe being Faith Ringgold, and, you know, an opportunity to kind of bring in more works by specific artists. But we changed our mind because there were so many great things out there. But you can see that they also focused on guys. So it wasn't only women, but I think you're right to think about the idea of a strong image of a woman is something that is appearing and new at this time. But I just love these two people because these look like the SNCC people. They are the SNCC people, you know, very well dressed. They're students. And I just love this young guy on the left. And here's John Lewis in a picture also in the show. And of course, you're going to see all of these upstairs in real time, in real life, by Danny Lyon. And when he was at Brooklyn Museum, he had the greatest story about being Danny Lyon's roommate during this time. And he was always afraid to go to the bathroom at night, he said, because he didn't know if there would be chemicals there and what he would run into in the bathroom. Because, of course, Danny Lyon's, you know, developing these pictures and all this stuff. But he also talked about dressing for the protest, right? And he being very conscious of what he would wear and how he would be seen. And not so much because he knew he would be photographed, but because he wanted to appear like a citizen, that he deserved this. And looking a certain way made him feel that way. And of course, that was part of the program of SNCC. So seeing this painting and then seeing this photograph, for me was just how, you know, the image of these beautiful young people who are striding forward to take power, but being also very polite. And of course, you know, that image would be superseded by Black Power, another different kind of power. You know, nevertheless, these kind of images. And I think, I didn't necessarily much of that. But also this, which you can go online, whitehouse.gov, and see the brief video of Ruby Bridges and President Obama in 2011 when the problem we all live with is hung at the White House. And they're interacting, right? And it's a great little video, but just to think about, there she is, you know, she's not really that old. You know, when you look at her, you're like, wow. You think she was a little girl, maybe she's dead. No, she's not. She's a grown woman. But just to think about that. And he actually says, you know, wow, it's safe to say I wouldn't be here without you. You know, it's a great little video. I encourage you to look at it. But just to think about, again, where art leads us in all this, and where students were asking this afternoon, you know, how do you think about art and activism? Well, art is just another manifestation of our lives on this planet. So of course it's involved with activism. It's involved with a lot of other things too. But so it's just great to see where this image ends up, you know, decades later. Other questions? Or tell me when you're ready to end it. Thank you. Thank you all. Great.